Hello, friends! Welcome to Feeling This Life. We're a family support podcast that dives deep into the triumphs, challenges, and strategies that are part of the lives of those who care for children with blindness and visual impairments. I'm Paige Maynard, and I'm an early interventionist and teacher of the visually impaired at VIPS, Visually Impaired Preschool Services.
And I'm Dr. Cathy Smith, Director of Research at Anchor Center for Blind Children in Denver, Colorado.
I'm jcastenir. I am the Family Services Coordinator at VIPS, and my youngest child has a visual impairment.
So today, I'm thrilled to introduce developmental psychology specialist, licensed professional counselor, and board-certified behavior analyst in private practice and as a contractor for Anchor Center for Blind Children in Denver, Colorado, Ali Huckins. She has worked with families and children in some capacity for over 20 years and has an extensive background in working with children, adolescents, and adults with autism spectrum disorder and sensory processing disorder. In addition, she's dedicated much of the last decade to working in collaboration with parents and caregivers to build healthy attachments with their children of any age. So, Ali, thank you for being willing to talk with me today about your work with the parents of young children with visual impairment.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, let's start with you as someone who supports others. What does self-care mean to you, and how do you practice it in your daily life?
Self-care to me is really a foundational element. Often I think of it similar to eating, drinking, and sleeping, and all the things that kind of just keep us alive. So I really do value it, and I do my best to make it possible for other people to do. So I know there are lots of programs where they, go for a weekend and spend a ton of money and you'll learn self-care, but I think a lot of us do it day to day. And so I really try to work with caregivers on how they're doing it already and what they can build on. So I really want it to be possible for everybody. And I think it is, with a little bit of creativity. I am pretty creative in my own self-care. I do everything from, if I have time to go for a long run or a hike, to baking something in my house. I consider that self-care. Also to just watching my own kids do their thing or feeling successful at work. So I really, like I said, I get really creative with how I define it. And I have found that that's very helpful, because then we can squeeze it in kind of everywhere we go. So
great. I really love that you think about watching your kids as self-care, because I think so many of us think of that as a task that has to be done, but it's a great example of what self-care can be. So awesome.
Yeah. And I also think that one person's self-care is not necessarily someone else's self-care. So a lot of it is about, what have you done today? Have you gone running? Have you gone to yoga? Have you gone swimming? Often we lean into the health field for self-care. And while I do think those are necessary, I don't always think it's somebody's preferred self-care. So that can feel more like a task sometimes too.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So maybe like even reading or just taking a bath is self-care too.
Yeah, or knitting, or
perfect.
The list is endless.
Right, exactly. So how do you specifically incorporate mindfulness practices into your self-care routine, and what benefits have you experienced as a result?
I think this is one of the main factors in self-care that I think is really important to incorporate, because it's a lot of giving yourself permission to engage in self-care and permission to consider things self-care. So again, leaning into what comes naturally to you, and really being congruent with yourself. On if you love to knit, that can be self-care. Even if you never make a blanket, if you never give a gift of something you've created, it can still be self-care, and it doesn't have to have this huge value. So it can, but that's a whole conversation that we have to have with ourselves around what's okay, and how we give ourselves permission to be okay with that, and to not listen to kind of the self-care world, you have to do this, and you have to buy this book, and you have to go on this retreat, and you have to spend a weekend away from your kid, or your child, which we'll get into later, of how much time do you have for self-care. And so I think the mindfulness comes in of giving yourself a permission to do something that feels good. And it might not be something you used to do. I used to run marathons, and I don't want to do that anymore. It's not something that I would find enjoyable at this point, because I want to be with my kids and I want to do some other things. So having those conversations with yourself and really being okay with what you come up with is a huge part of, maybe the biggest part of self-care.
That's great.
Being okay with what you find.
I love that. That's so true, because I can think of several conversations I've had with parents, with friends who are doing quilting, and they'll say to me, "Oh, I have to finish this quilt," and I'm like, "No, you really don't. You don't have to finish it. So if you want to finish it, great, but you really don't have to do that." So maybe that's self-care, is saying, I don't have to do this anymore.
I do think that's a big part, and it's kind of on always my list of things I give, suggestions I give, of being, seeing a friend and not seeing a friend can have the same self-care, or finishing the quilt or not finishing the quilt can actually both provide self-care depending on where you are and what's going on for you. And so.
Great. Okay. So what are some of the things that you hear most frequently from caregivers of young children with visual impairment regarding the ways they prioritize their child's self-care needs?
This is a question that I actually have never, until recently, looked at it from this perspective. And I think it's actually one of the most valuable perspectives to have, because we often put our kids well before ourselves. And so I think we prioritize our children in a way that sometimes takes away from our own self-care, but I think is also something parents often, or caregivers often, do very naturally, of sacrificing something they might want to do or they feel they should do for their child's self-care or happiness. So I think it's just a great way to look at it, because when the industry looks at self-care, we often look at self, and I think a lot of times caregivers are taking care of many selves. So they're taking care of maybe their child with a vision impairment, maybe other children as well, siblings or grandchildren, or, they have their own family and they're maybe nannying for a child with a vision impairment. And so I think it's interesting to consider other people's self-care in the process. And I think especially kids at Anchor Center, they have a lot of therapies and a lot of appointments. And so those often come before also even their child's self-care. So the more I talk to parents, the more I encourage them again to sometimes cancel a therapy. Not always an appointment, because I know those are really hard to get, but a therapy if your child's having a week where they're just not feeling great, or they would prefer to be outside, or they seem to want to go to the park or the zoo, that giving some permission in there to also kind of do the same thing we just talked about with the quilting of, I know therapy is really important, but my kid also wants to do this other thing, or they might be happier if we go to the zoo today, or if we go to the park today, or if we don't go on the play date today. And so factoring that in, I think, is a whole juggling act that I hadn't really considered, but definitely will use that perspective going forward as well, because a caregiver is juggling that too. We want our kid to be happy and get therapy and have childhood experiences like go to the zoo and get to that appointment. So
right.
I think that complicates things a little bit, but it's also something we need to keep in mind, because I think caregivers are doing that very naturally without knowing that they're trying to juggle that piece too.
Absolutely. I think you're right. How does caring for a young child who is blind or has a visual impairment most impact the caregivers that you talk to, their self-care routine? I know you've talked about this a little bit, but can you speak to anything that you hear constantly, specifically for kids with visual impairment, that seem to be a concern?
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what I just said, of our culture tends to honor commitment above everything else, sometimes above happiness. So a lot of times I talk with parents and caregivers at Anchor Center specifically about the number of therapies they have. Yeah. And this comes up a lot. The caregiver feels very strongly that they do everything they can for their child, in these crucial windows of development. So that often means having many therapies a day. Sometimes families are having 7 or 8 therapists or 5 therapists and a doctor's appointment, and they're coming to Anchor Center. And I think a lot of times their self-care kind of gets put on the back burner to manage all of these appointments and to do everything that they've been told they need to do. In addition to that, the therapists each come with ideas. So if you have even just 3 therapists, and they each have 3 ideas that you need to do throughout the week until between the times you see them, I mean, we're really up to like a lot that this caregiver is now responsible for and feels very responsible for, feels the pressure to do this in their child's best interest. I often encourage a parent or caregiver to say to a therapist, I can do one of those. Which one should I do this week? Or I can fit in it this number of times, but I don't think I can do that every day or at every meal or every bath time or every transition, which is kind of what we're asking them to do. So I think it impacts, it's impossible for it not to impact a caregiver's self-care routine. It's hard when your child might not sleep through the night or sleeps through the night once and not again. And that's throwing, you had hoped to get up and work out before they got up, and now that's not going to happen. So I think, again, it's kind of into that mindfulness realm of honoring and giving somebody permission to say, I can't do that this week. I need to take care of myself, or I can't do all of that this week because I still need to fit in time to read or knit or go for a run or, all of that. So it's impossible for it to not impact. There's also just kind of a slice of life that our parents and caregivers are in right now of raising children, and that is really demanding.
Yes.
But the caregivers and parents of kids with vision impairments don't necessarily have the luxury of dropping a child off at the daycare at the rec center or the gym, or having, arranging a play date and then going and doing something for themselves. It's just a lot more complicated for a kid who might not see well or has other medical needs.
Why do you think that is? That's an interesting perspective.
I believe at many rec centers or gyms, they'd be happy to have a child with a vision impairment, but it's a lot more work. You have to go through this is, the potential, or please don't leave toys in the middle of the room, or I'm going to help him map out the room. And then you kind of have to honor that. And I think that's just much harder. It's more it's more demanding. You have to weigh, is it worth going to the gym if I have to do all that?
That's true.
So I would love, that's kind of building that community of people who can help with some of that is hard, but valuable at the same time.
Do you hear from parents? Do they often say that I can't just leave my child on a play date? Do you hear that feedback from them?
Yeah, very often we hear things, of that sort, or I can't go to the gym, or I can only go to the gym if this provider, this daycare provider is there at the time, or I can only have this family member watch my child because they're the only ones who understand the needs, or, are respectful of the vision component.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and then, it just is hard to find people who are qualified. And that limits a lot of self-care opportunities.
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if all our child care providers and all of our family members were qualified? So I would imagine, do you work with caregivers at all to help them manage the working with family members so that they can feel comfortable?
Yeah, we often do a whole talk on family members.
Okay.
And we have a range from family members who are extremely involved and want to learn, and family members that, believe in tough love and they should just learn to navigate by themselves. Yeah. There's certainly a range, and I think often when we have families that have support, they're almost like reluctant to share that, because I think for some families it's so hard to find somebody that can watch their child and have them feel comfortable.
Right.
I think a lot of times you can have a babysitter who's happy to do more or less what you want them to do, but it's really hard, I think, as a parent of a child with a vision impairment or medical need to just leave.
Yeah.
And say, we'll see you in a couple hours. So working on that, building some trust with some people. And Anchor does often offer one night where families can come, and it's always well attended. And we have nursing and staff and stuff. And so
yes, and we have, I want to say we have nurses and at least one or two therapists are there, so parents do know that there are people who are quote unquote qualified to take care of whatever may occur. So that's interesting. I don't always think about that impacting parents' ability to have self-care activities, but you're absolutely right. So on that, and there's one more question that I want to ask you. So do you hear, so I know that you work with other children with other disabilities, and do you hear more things about comments from caregivers about sleeping or eating than you do from other groups of caregivers? I think that's how I
like in
it.
terms of are those some challenges that families face more?
Yes.
Than
yes.
Others? Yeah, I mean, and I'm always happy to talk more about some of those topics, because I think that they greatly impact. I mean, vision and eating and vision and sleeping are almost impossible to pull apart.
Exactly. Yes.
We eat with our eyes. I know everybody has heard that before, but I always tell a little story of, I ate a grape once in the car, and it was dark and it was a bad grape. And then I was like, I'm never eating grapes again, because I didn't know it was coming. And I use that a lot because I think that's a huge part of vision and eating. And same with sleep. But I think that across the communities I work with, including, kind of the autism community, sensory processing, some of that neurodiversity, it poses a lot of challenge for self-care, because again, we don't have the same community acceptance or community resources to just plop our kids somewhere and then go off and do something, or have grandparents watch when you go away for a weekend. But I think the vision component is really specific and unique in that a kid feels nervous. So sometimes in those other communities, the caregiver is anxious about it. I think a kid with a vision impairment just kind of plopped in a daycare center, at a rec center, is also going to feel very nervous. They don't know where they are. They don't know where things are. They don't know who else is there. So, and a lot of times the caregiver is kind of their eyes. And so now, they're very alone. And I think that's a different dynamic, and it kind of gets into a whole area more challenging than if you have vision.
I agree. All right. So can you tell me what advice you give to parents or caregivers who are struggling to prioritize their own self-care needs? That's something hopefully that's realistic and successful.
One of my favorite ones is to give yourself credit for things you've already done or are going to do. Kind of like when you put things on your to-do list that you've already done, just so you can cross them off. Because there are a lot of things caregivers are already doing that might not necessarily feel directly like self-care, but you can give yourself credit, and credit always feels good.
That's right.
We all love that. So kind of going through the day and really saying, like, I do keep all these therapy appointments, and I do, make these special meals, and I do these things that just our parents and caregivers are doing naturally and should get credit for. And then kind of exploring some hobbies, even if you don't think you're going to do them forever. So you might like to learn to knit, and maybe you're not going to knit forever, but maybe it's something that's just interesting right now, and that's okay too. Sometimes self-care feels like it has to be this huge goal, this huge process, and it really shouldn't be. My biggest one is not to go on social media as much, because someone has always done something better or bigger or something. If I go and run 6 miles and I go to my Facebook page, there's probably someone who's run 8. And now it just kind of took away from my self-care a little bit, or sometimes a lot. So that's a really tricky one, because we are on social media a lot and people do post what they're doing for their self-care. So trying not to be in competition with other people, much easier said than done, but a huge one that I recommend.
Yes.
And then creating habits. Again, it doesn't have to be a weekend away. That doesn't have to be self-care. While that's lovely, it doesn't have to be that big. Or my kids are 8 and 12 now, so I can go for pretty long runs. Does not have to be like that. It can be one chore or helping somebody else. I think one strategy is really reaching out to other people to help them or to be helped is really also a great self-care strategy. So I, again, try to be really creative, and I really recommend that for other people.
And that's a perfect, to my last question here. So some strategies to building that supportive community of fellow caregivers and allies who can offer emotional and practical support. So like you said, reaching out to...
Yeah, I think you have to really, again, be honest with who you want your group to be. So sometimes people go by their child's diagnosis. Some people go by their hobby. I mean, I think that there's so many different outlets, and as much as I don't like social media, there are some good resources on finding different groups that are you. And I think that's, again, a really hard skill, especially for caregivers in this, what I call the slice of life where you're raising children, because it's hard to know who you are. But really identifying who you kind of want your tribe to be. And sometimes it's nice to balance. You have one group where you reach out and it's maybe more diagnosis based, and then one group that's more hobby based. So you have some self in there too, but you're also having a platform to lean into when you're having a really hard day, or you've gotten some medical news that is really hard to process and you need some help there. Versus the day when you don't want to address that at all and you lean into your own hobby. So it's hard for me to, again, just like imposing self-care on somebody else never works. It's hard for me to say you have to go find this one group or be part of this. Yeah. But I always also recommend just attach yourself to the group, even if you don't plan to go, even if you don't want to go to a meeting or a gathering, or maybe you want to go once, but feeling attached to something, it's really, really, really vital to our own selves. We're not designed to be alone, and often having a child with any sort of different learning process feels very lonely. So humans are not meant to be alone. So any attachment to a group, even if you get one post a week or you do one thing a month, it has a huge impact on your own mental health to know you're attached to something. That's just how we are by design.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you so much for your time and all that you do. We appreciate that you spent this time with us and giving family members who have young children with visual impairment some insight on how they can support their children, themselves, and others as they navigate these early years. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. So it was really fun to listen to Ali, and she really made me think about some things that seem obvious, but maybe I don't think about them in terms of self-care. I don't have any great, wonderful research for you this week, but I do want to reflect a little bit and talk a little bit about a personal experience. So I stopped doing to-do lists. I was really glad that Ali talked about to-do lists, and I stopped doing them several years ago because I realized sometimes, you have this great to-do list and maybe you do half of one and then you feel like I did nothing today. And the truth is, you always do something. So instead of having a to-do list, I have a all done list. So when it's the last 15 minutes or something before I'm not going to work anymore, or I'm going to end my day, I think back about what did I do today, and maybe it was just send an email to someone, or I wrote a conference proposal, or I did the laundry. So, and I think for parents it could be, I fed my kids today, all three of them had food, and I watered the plants. And so really sitting down and thinking about what did you do today and writing it down and then feeling good about it. That's self-care too, even though it's about what you have to do.
I think I like thinking about it that way because it even reminds me of some of the things that Ali said about self-care being possible for everybody if you're creative. And that's a kind of creative way to do it, because she also kind of talked about the mindfulness part of it, giving yourself permission to call things self-care and to be able to change that internal dialogue you have with yourself of, oh, I need to do these 10 things today, and you don't get them done, and then you have negative self-talk, and that might not be caring for yourself. Whereas if you kind of flip the script for yourself and say to yourself, wow, I was able to blah 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 today, good job, self, give yourself a pat on the back, then maybe that isn't that thing that other people say that you should do for self-care. It's the change of your mindset, and I like it being that creative way to kind of change the way that you think about it.
Yeah, it's an active process, right? So you're acting on yourself. You're not letting other people say, well, you didn't get your to-do list done today, so you're That's worthless. Right. Because honestly, we all do great things. I have a sister-in-law who says when you're having a hard day, just make sure you take care of all the things that are alive first. And your plants, your kids, your pets, and then everything else is gravy. So
well, I would say, speaking of lists, it reminds me of Ali talking about sometimes therapists or other people will give families lists of things. Yes. And I was curious, Jenny, for you, what experiences you have with other people's ideas and lists impacting your self-care.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this also goes in with how she said, get creative and do what works for you. I remember one time when the girls were really little, I was just really struggling because I was working full time. I still do work full time, but it was just, I felt like, when they went to bed earlier, I wasn't spending as much time with them, and I was just really struggling with it. And I said something to a therapist once about how I just felt, really anxious and almost depressed that I wasn't ever with them, or I didn't feel like I was with them as much as I should be or I want to be. And her response was that I needed to take some time for myself and kind of get away and just have time to reconnect with myself. And I sat there and I thought, I just told you that I'm stressed because I don't see my kids enough. So you want my self-care for me to be to send them away? Yeah. And then I'm going to feel even worse about myself.
Then there's another thing on your list.
Yeah. So I just was like, okay, this is not, and to hear someone say that the freedom to choose your own self-care, I think that's great. And I mean, I'm not mom of the year or anything. There are definitely times that I do want to send my kids somewhere and I want to be by myself, and I feel over touched and, over talked to and everything. But at that moment, it was just one of those things where I think people just automatically think, oh, take time for yourself, which was the exact opposite of what I said.
Absolutely. I love that she said that sometimes watching your kids can be your self-care. What a wonderful thought. And I don't even think that we think that that's okay to be self-care. So, yeah, it's all about that permission to enjoy whatever it is you choose your self-care to be.
I did a training one time and I heard a lady talking about how the smell of her dog is like self-care to her. Like she loves being with her dog and like the smell of the dog just relaxes her. And I was like, oh my gosh, I always think my dog smells good and my husband thinks that that's so weird. See, everything works for different people in different ways.
Yes. No judgment on self-care, right? Whatever you choose for your self-care, for sure. I think another topic that she brought up that I didn't think about as being self-care or impacting self-care is being able to find family members or a place where your child feels safe, you feel safe leaving your child. As parents, it doesn't matter who you are, everybody needs alone time sometimes. So how are you going to do some of those things? And having to go the extra mile is to prepare that relief time is, respite or whatever you call it, is challenging.
I was just thinking about also, there have been some times where for some of my home visits with my families, where they'll say, oh, I'm going to be doing, something else, their grandma is going to be doing the visit with you, or a family friend or something like that. And then there have been times where I've been tempted to say something like, oh, it's okay, you don't have to worry about it. If we need to cancel, just let me know. But then another thing that I kind of started thinking about is what a wonderful opportunity during early intervention to practice just for an hour, to have somebody else kind of take that role on for you. And then it kind of has a little bit of a twofold purpose that, our job as early interventionists is to help equip and encourage caregivers and families. So then you kind of get a double benefit of that person that you have trusted for that hour. Now they've learned some strategies to use with your child, and then could increase the trust that you have for them, could increase the ways that they're able to care for your child, so that it can increase those things later on. So it's this little bit of a practice that you get in the early years. So I really like it when some of my families try to do that at times that are appropriate.
Yeah, I really like that. I would have never thought about it that way, but I think especially families that have multiple kids in lots of therapies and they're trying so hard to fit them in, like there is nothing wrong with having someone else take them when needed. Yeah. So yeah, I like that.
A thing also that I was listening to when Ali was talking was she used that term that this is your slice of life right now, and to expect things maybe to be different in the future, and that this is only for a time. And one of the other things that it made me think about is a lot of families of our kiddos, that slice of life for you might be a little bit bigger, or it might be a little bit longer, and that might look different maybe than some other families. And Cathy, I know you have some good insights about that. So what is your advice to our families, our listeners?
Well, I would hope that even if your slice of life doesn't change that much, that over time, so if you're still having to do some tasks with your child when they're young adults or teenagers, that you've built a community around you that you can trust to support you, that you've found different strategies so that you can, and it may seem impossible when they're little, how am I going to do this? But you can make decisions in your life as going forward as this is what I need. So deciding what your self-care is, how am I going to do this? Maybe I'm going to train a certain nurse or family member or whatever, so that I can have a break occasionally. And it's okay to do that, but you need to figure out your community that you can depend on, I think.
Yeah, I think it's good to allow yourself again to prioritize that part of self-care. And I'm sure that there might be times where training somebody to care for your child or practicing letting somebody care for them or take them to a visit or an appointment or something like that might feel like work. But thinking about it, kind of in a little bit of a different way, it may be an investment in how things might go maybe in a couple of years, where you're building a foundation to help your child feel more confident, yourself feel more confident, other caregivers to feel more confident. And then that paves the way for everybody to be more independent as they need, and for you to get the amount of self-care that you need, if that does involve stepping away for a time from your kiddo, and then allowing your child to be able to do some of those things too, because a lot of times whenever they're with somebody else, their voice sometimes will get a little bit louder because they want to be heard. And so maybe can be seen as an opportunity for that.
And Paige, I think you were telling us earlier about a really good strategy that a mom had about training that kind of is out of the box, right?
Yes. At our family retreat at VIPS every year, we have a weekend where families go for, we hope, some self-care sorts of programming, and their kids come and are provided childcare by us as the teachers at VIPS, and we have nursing staff and people who are caregivers. And so what happens is oftentimes this will be the first time, or one of the very first times, that this child has ever been left with anybody other than their parents or somebody who's really close. And one of my moms did something that helped me immensely to care for her child. He had a specific way that his G-tube bags needed to be primed and cared for and washed. And so she took video and had all of this information in a Google folder that she just shared with me. And so I was able to watch it beforehand and get an idea of how it worked to do all of those things to care for him. And then actually while I was doing it, I could refer back to the video. So I didn't have to call her or text her during the retreat to say, wait, can you walk me through that again? So that made it better for me to care for him. And I was really never able to ask her thoughts or, like how she felt that went. But I can imagine that folder could be shared with anybody that cares for him. And now she's only ever had to walk anybody through it once, and they can refer back to it anytime, rather than having to touch base with her like while she's in the middle of something. So I really liked seeing that. And I know I have some other families who they write down, like in a Google Doc or in something that can be shared, even if it's just a paper list. When my kid does this, it means this. Their communication cues can be different than kids who are sighted or kids who are able-bodied. And that can be so helpful, because sometimes, this certain cry or this certain, head movement means something to you as the caregiver, but everybody else has to learn that. And allowing for that release to happen and communicating that just with, just a list of these are the things to watch out for could be really helpful.
I like that too. As a parent, I think that writing those kinds of things down or having them somewhere can kind of give you peace of mind as well, even if you're not doing it for a purpose, like going on a retreat or something like that. I mean, if there was an emergency one day and you absolutely had to leave your kid somewhere, it's done. And I like being proactive like that, things that not everyone would know about your kid, and just having that there is, you may never use it, which is fine, but it's there if you need it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. And we thank Ali for giving us her insights, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to Feeling This Life. Did you know that this podcast is actually part of a research study? By filling out the survey in the show notes, you can help our community learn more about how podcasts impact those who care for children who are blind and visually impaired. So please take a look when you're able. Also, if you'd like to support us in making more episodes of Feeling This Life, look for the donation link in the show notes. The show notes also include links to resources related to today's episode and ways to get in contact with us. Please join us again next time for another episode of Feeling This Life.